haven't been with Gold Country before. I've been to just about all the other groups in town and been members of several over the years. So it's good to be with Gold Country up here in the scenic foothills. So yes, I am going to talk about my primary area of fiction writing, which is thrillers. And so I write thriller novels of suspense and mayhem that have real science as a core part of the plot and the themes. And in the time that I've been working, it just occurred to me I need to watch the time. Is there? Oh yes, there's the clock. Okay. I have had the opportunity to participate in International Thriller Writers' annual conference called Thriller Fest. And as part of Thriller Fest, they have an event called Craft Fest, which I highly recommend for people who are interested in really learning the craft of thriller fiction writing. It's a 2-day event, very intensive thing. And the beautiful thing is you don't actually have to go to the convention in New York to attend Craft Fest. You can get the recordings and purchase them online and get your own Craft Fest at home. So a lot of the things that I'm going to say came from teachers at Craft Fest and some other resources that I've used. So coming from the best of the best by way of me talking to you today. So Margie introduced you a little bit to me. I do have a background as a medical scientist and professor, writer with International Thriller Writers, blogging, and 3 novels so far. So just a little thought about Bisac Codes. I don't know if all of you are familiar with these. When you put a book into the market, it's going to be categorized. It's going to be shelved in a library or in a bookstore. And that choice of where it goes is going to be based on an elaborate system of classification called the Bisac Codes. And so as you can see, they get quite specific, of course, for fiction and nonfiction. This is the section just for thrillers. All the different codes for thrillers in the Bisac. And I bring this up because I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of meeting reader expectations. Okay, there are bad books in the world. I think we can all agree on that. But in terms of, are there good books? What makes a good book? A huge part of what makes a book a good book is, did it meet the reader's expectation for what they were looking for? And with genre fiction and thrillers, that is particularly important. If somebody picks up a book that's telegraphing that it's a thriller by the title, the cover, and the back cover copy, you darn well better be meeting their expectations for what's supposed to be there and how it's done. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is kind of standard tricks that are used for thriller fiction and also other genre fiction in general. And you don't have to do this. You don't have to do anything when you write your own book. But knowing what the expectations are of the reader can help make it a better book for your readers.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Could we dim those lights so we could see the screen?
Let's see if the
Better.
projection lights.
There.
Can we make the projection
Yeah.
larger?
Thank you.
We cannot make it larger because that would require pushing this
Is
away,
that
and
what
we're all
Phil's doing?
kind of stuck there.
What?
Is this blocking it though?
No.
No, you can see it.
Did I miss
I'm also going to be reading some excerpts from the book on the right, the Stephen James book, Troubleshooting Your Novel, which I have with me, that I absolutely highly recommend this book for all fiction writers. It's super readable and kind of beautifully laid out, makes it easy on the eyes. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from that because I think it's brilliant.
Oops.
Oh, yes, I'll come back to it. Stephen James, Troubleshooting Your Novel. Anybody happen to recognize this painting?
Is it a Van Gogh?
It is not a Van Gogh.
Van Gogh.
It's called Science and Charity from 1897. Does anybody happen to recognize something about this?
Pablo.
Yeah, so that's very clearly a Picasso. It's called The Weeping Woman from 1937. This is a Picasso from 1897 when he was 15 years old. He painted this. Shocking, right? Same artist. Okay. So the point of showing you these two images is that when Pablo Picasso started breaking all the rules in his art, It wasn't because he couldn't do this or that he didn't know how to do this. It was a conscious choice. And that's the kind of repeating what I said about all the tips and tricks and guidelines and standards that I'm about to give you are, kind of this. But you don't have to do any of them, but you better know what they are and make a choice and not do it, in a lazy or unthoughtful way, because, it's going to affect how people read the book and how they enjoy the book. So make a choice of when you're going to break the rules. It's best to know the rules that you're breaking. So again, and this is going to be sort of a high-level survey, smorgasbord course, not an in-depth on any one thing. Every one of these topics that I dance through is, worthy of entire books written about the craft on each of them. But we'll give you kind of a sense of, so you can maybe learn to know what you don't know, sort of thing. Okay, so point of view, often abbreviated as POV, yeah, I've heard people say POV, but I think that that's kind of funny. So POV is usually what people say. Point of view is the perspective from which the story is being written. Whose head are we inside? Whose eyes are seeing the story? In contemporary thriller fiction, by far the most popular points of view are what's called tight third person, sometimes alternating with first person. So what does that mean? In a third person point of view, the story is being told from sort of a he-she perspective. So you would have whatever is the main, the character in a particular scene, who's your point of view character, you would be hearing their internal thoughts, interpreting their way of seeing the room. Yeah, so that's the third person, and that is kind of the standard. If you look at fiction from 100 years ago, there was a lot more of the omniscient point of view, which was sort of a godlike perspective where you could have the internal thoughts of anybody in the scene, or you could bounce from, you as the author writing from that point of view, you could reveal information that no one in the scene would know. You totally can still write in that point of view, but you better choose your point of view when you're writing the book and then be consistent throughout. And actually, the choice of point of view at the very beginning, how you're going to write a book, seems like it might be obvious sometimes, but a lot of times it's not, and it has a huge impact on the book you eventually write. Whose story do you want to tell? Who do you want to be, associated with as the writer, and then for the reader through the course of that book? So I know on my third book, I experimented with a couple. I wasn't really sure whose story it was going to be, whose point of view it was going to be in. And you may, get very far into a book and decide it needs to change, and you can go back and change it. Within the technique of once you've chosen your point of view, stay in one point of view for each scene or chapter. This is definitely one of the most broken rules in earlier drafts of books that still need some editing. And it's also one of the rules that I think you should most try to avoid breaking for any reason. It's very distracting to the reader, and they probably won't even realize why when you bounce from one point of view character to another within a scene or within a chapter. And it can be very subtle. I'll give a quick example. A tip is to use to help the reader appreciates the experience better if they are firmly anchored in the point of view from the start of the scene. They know, it's like they subconsciously know whose head you're in. So it's helpful to use the point of view character's name as the first word or in the first sentence of the new scene or chapter, so that the reader is really solidly knows who am I with here. When you're in somebody's, I don't need to say about that. But so examples of POV shifts. Here's Emma felt panic rise in her belly, and she searched the room for an escape, but Julie knew there was no way out. So there's a point of view shift inherent in that sentence. We're starting out, we're feeling what Emma feels. So we're definitely in Emma's point of view, but then we learn something that Julie knows. So you're literally inside both their heads. You're getting their internal thoughts, feelings, reactions. Now you could convey this information solidly from one of those 2 points of view, just use dialogue or use some kind of gesture. So for example, if we were in Julie's point of view, she could observe Emma doing something that indicates panic, and then she could say out loud, "There's no way out." And that would keep you, in one point of view. But as read there, it's 2 points of view in the same sentence. I stood on the sidewalk and waved at passing cars. A guy waiting for the bus thought I was crazy. So that's first person point of view. It's in the I voice, but there's a point of view shift in the sentence because we're inside, the I, but then I say, a guy waiting for the bus thought I was crazy. Oh yeah, I couldn't remember what I was saying. Avoid psychic assumptions or motives. That's what's happening there. The narrator is making an assumption about that other person in the scene. Now, the guy may very well think that I is crazy, and if we need to say that, then we need to have the I voice, the I person, notice something that the guy is doing, like he scowled at me, he turned away, he does something that's observable, but that's not just inside his head. So those are, I think, the most subtle examples of point of view shift. Oftentimes they're much more obvious than that. You're totally changing from one character's point of view to another. So don't do it. In general, I've heard it said that you should minimize the number of point of view characters across the book as a whole. Maybe 3 to 5 tops. Don't give giving a character a point of view in a chapter or a scene gives them a certain importance. And it's a little bit of making a promise to the reader that this is an important character and not just a sideshow or a throwaway. So don't give it to what they call red shirt characters, which is here we have a sci-fi writer here, so that's an old Star Trek term. That if a guy showed up in uniform in the early Star Trek episodes in the security guard red shirt, he would be dead, usually within the first few minutes, but certainly by the end of the episode. So don't give characters like that a point of view in your book, if you can avoid it at all. And then the most important thing about point of view is to avoid those shifts. The second most important is that point of view is an important tool for revealing character. It's way more important than you might think at first, and that's why kind of exploring whose point of view you want to use for a book is really important, because it's important for plot, especially if you're writing something where there's information, like in a mystery, that you need to convey or want to avoid conveying. You use point of view to make that contract with the reader, but it also reveals character. So, for example, somebody might come to this meeting. All of you came to this meeting. So, if I was in your point of view, perhaps when you walked into the room, you noticed that they had coffee out because you were thinking it's time for coffee, and that was really exciting to you. And so, in your point of view, you would walk in. We would say something about you smelling the coffee and your feelings about that. Maybe you got here and you looked around like, wow, look at all those airplanes. I've always been interested in flight, and I see they have posters up about learning to fly and all this. Two people experiencing the exact same thing from different points of view creates a completely different narrative. And so you use point of view to do that, to show something about what characters notice, what they think is important, what they're thinking about, how they respond. Your opening. Something interesting should happen right away in any book, let's face it. Fiction, nonfiction, genre fiction, literary fiction. Now that is not the same as saying, like in a thriller, somebody has to die, although that often does happen. But it should be in some fashion interesting. Ideally, it should be external, not inside somebody's head. So starting just entirely in like somebody's thoughts, when we don't know the character or anything about the setting, is can often be off-putting. And right away doesn't necessarily mean the first sentence, of course. It means in the opening page or pages. But the opening sentence is important, and it should be in a perfect world, it should be an invitation that expresses the book's voice and is a promise of what is to come. So oftentimes, you should write your first sentence last, or towards the end of the process, or in a rewrite. You can kind of look at what the whole book is like, how it turns out, and then rephrase your opening sentence maybe to reflect that in terms of tone or foreshadowing or something. It's always fun to read some, attention-grabbing opening sentences. So here's one that many of you will recognize. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. It's the opening of George Orwell's 1984, and it just has a tone that establishes, like the whole tone of the book. It's disconcerting. It's harsh. It's sci-fi-ish, dystopian. It's like a dystopian sentence for a dystopian book. The last camel collapsed at noon is a opening sentence for a Ken Follett thriller called The Key to Rebecca. And I haven't read the book, honestly, but it's just that's a sentence that makes a promise for what kind of book it is. And if he follows through on that promise, well done. Another thriller, The Screams had finally ceased. Opening sentence, right? Okay, you know what you're getting. And my second book, the opening sentence is $50,000 US sealed in watertight stacks of $100 bills was peculiar baggage for a hike. Which I hope sets a certain tone for, it tells you hopefully that it's a thriller novel. Opening, not the opening sentence, but openings should have a hook. Author Joseph Finder describes the hook as the opening gambit that reels you in. Hook should be authentic and consistent with the story, not just a one-off attention grabber. Although we've all read, well, if you read thriller fiction, you've read thrillers that have kind of openings that don't necessarily tie in organically with the rest of the book, but that's not good. Ideally, your opening should tie in very closely with the rest. You can and should come back and change the hook if the story evolves. And the hook sucks in the reader and makes them want to know what happens next. That's always the key, especially in genre fiction. What happens next? That's what gets the reader to keep turning the pages. And you should be able to express your hook in a sentence or two. So here's some examples of hooks. A construction worker gets mauled by an actual live dinosaur. Just, at this point, pretty familiar, but that's the opening scene of Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park. It's certainly an opening gambit that reels you in. It's totally organically related to everything that comes later, and it definitely makes you want to know what happens next. A satellite crashes in a tiny town in the desert, and within 24 hours, everyone is dead except an old sterno-drinking alcoholic and a screaming infant. What the heck? That's also Michael Crichton. That's his Andromeda strain from 1969, one of the most amazingly time for that kind. It's like one of the first real science thrillers written, and it has aged really well. It's amazing how well that book has aged. The hook in thrillers should set the reader on edge, make them fearful, uneasy, or expectant. And you can start with one hook in the opening and move on to the bigger novel-wide hook later. So in the case of like the construction worker getting mauled, that's one scene. It's tied to the rest, but that's not the hook for the whole book. It gets bigger, which is another thing I'll talk about, rising stakes in thriller fiction. So I'm going to read a little, this is one of my favorite excerpts from the Stephen James Troubleshooting Your Novel book about openings to avoid. And you don't see them too much. You might see them in self-published fiction. You won't see them much in published fiction anymore. But I've seen, I do some manuscript editing, and it's amazing how often I see these openings. And they say, there are no rules, but the rule is to avoid these. A vehicle comes to a stop. Someone drives up to an office building, a cabin, a military barracks, or whatever. The vehicle might be a sports coupe, a creepy van, a World War I biplane, a cruise ship, or an intergalactic starfighter. It doesn't matter, it's all the same. Readers have seen it a million times. Recast your scene. So don't start with that. And this is the one that I see. A person wakes up. It's such a temptation to do this. Her alarm goes off or her phone rings, awakening her before she's ready. She slumps out of bed where she's probably alone or with someone who means nothing to her. She gets dressed for work, for school, to go for a jog, then makes breakfast, feeds the dog, whatever. No, I'm not kidding. As overused and trite as this opening is, some authors still use it. He also recommends against having a point of view character getting killed off. Readers learn about the background, start to care about him, and then here comes the amazing plot twist. He's killed at the end of the scene. How original. Fix it. And that's kind of related to the red shirt thing and also having anyway. So the waking up thing is really big though. And I think, there's some vehicle cruising to a stop is also. So there's hook and then there's theme. This is from a lecture by Daniel Palmer, another thriller novelist. Have both a what if question in mind and a big overriding idea that defines the book. So hook is, answers, kind of presents what would happen if, whatever the hook is. And the theme is what the book is really about. And so to give an example, I got some examples of those two things. Many of you may be familiar with the Terminator movies, the old Schwarzenegger film. The hook is what if a cyborg is sent back through time to murder the mother of the future savior of mankind. It's a pretty good hook. But what's the book really about? What are the story, the themes? Love, predestination, technological overreach. In the book and movie The Martian, the hook is what if a man were stranded on Mars? What the book is really about is space travel, resourcefulness, loyalty, and courage. In my book Petroplague, the hook is what if bacteria that eat gasoline got into the fuel supply of Los Angeles? But the book's themes are dependence on fossil fuels and unintended consequences. This is my favorite takeaway from the whole talk, is this little equation of what makes a story, and this comes from novelist Steve Berry. Goals plus motivation plus conflict. You must have all three to have a story. Whether it's a small story or a big story, doesn't matter. Your character has to want something, have a goal. Something must stand in their way, and they have to have a reason for wanting it. Content characters are boring. Why would the reader care if the protagonist does not care either? So goals are not enough. There has to be a reason to pursue them. Somebody might have a goal of getting an ice cream cone. So what? Something has to be driving it. There has to be a motivation. What if this person who wants an ice cream cone lives in a dystopian world where dairy products have been banned? Which is a horrible thought. And then they need motivation and conflict. Need all three. Excuse me. So, for example, Joe is shipwrecked on a desert island. His goal is to get off the island. Got a goal. He's motivated to do so because he will die of thirst within 3 days. So we've got goals and motivation, but we need conflict. What if Joe gets on his cell phone and calls for help, and the Coast Guard comes and gets him a couple hours later? No story, because no conflict. We got goals and motivation, but no conflict. And you can imagine ways to wrap that around. You have any two of the three, but not all three, you don't have a story. Pay attention to causality. Your story should progress from one cause to an effect, and then onward. If you have to explain why something just happened, you're telling the story backward. If an event has no cause, readers will find it unbelievable. If the cause isn't strong enough, the event will seem contrived. And then in thriller fiction, we have this issue with believability, that events in your book can be ludicrous, but they cannot seem ludicrous. And that works both ways. I reread a science thriller novel once set in Antarctica, and a key plot element of this book was roving bands of murdering rats in Antarctica. Supposedly were going around, it was one of the major threats to the characters, is that they would be attacked by these bands of rats. And it just, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it just seemed so ludicrous to me. The author, I actually, kind of communicated with the author about it, and she said, no, it's true. They exist. And that was a good example to me of just because something is true doesn't mean it's believable. And I've heard authors in my writers groups here in town talking like that too. They've got, this thing that, this thing really happened, and everybody's like, well, it may really have happened, but that doesn't make it believable. How much detail to put in your story? Now, thriller fiction and mysteries too nowadays, there's one of the ways of distinguishing your work and separating it from the pack is to have a particular sort of theme. Like for cozy mysteries, it's all of, you'll have the cheese shop mysteries, or you'll have the cruise ship mysteries, or the mysteries that are all set, with a character who's a teacher or a real estate agent or something. And so you have kind of a world and a lingo to tap into, which makes it interesting. Some of you may have seen the TV series, the chess one. I lost the name of it. The Queen's Gambit was a whole series kind of about chess. I mean, chess was a huge part of it. I mean, it was about the character. It was the character story, but it was set in this world of chess. So how much chess detail did they incorporate into that series? Well, quite a bit. And that's engaging and interesting to people if they can learn something new. But in a novel, if you do it too much, then people are turned off. They don't want to know the intricacies of all the chess openings in your novel. They might find it interesting that chess openings exist, but they don't want to have all of that in the book. So you may be very interested in whatever that thing is for your book. For me, it's microbiology, but you don't want to put in more than is necessary. How much is necessary depends on who's your ideal reader. So you should have some thinking about that. Who do you want to read this book? Do you want this book to appeal to a general thriller audience, or do you want to specifically appeal to people who have some reason to be interested in the sciences? Like you want to market to teachers or to nurses or something. And then you can go a little bit further with that, and that would make it more interesting to that audience, perhaps. Too much of that, and you'll confuse or bore the general reader, but if you have too little, then you might disappoint someone who was looking for it. And yeah, plausibility matters more than accuracy. Twists and surprises are really important, really nice whenever you can add them. They're related to causality. So a plot twist can't come out of nowhere. It has to be dependent upon and caused by whatever came before. The trick is manipulating reader expectation and to make them expect one outcome and then give them another. Minor believable twists are better than big ones that make the reader go, So how do you create a good twist? A good twist is, and then this is a quote from Stephen James, a good twist is both inevitable and unexpected. It's justified, logical, and yet unpredictable as well. Tips for getting that done, he says, choose story elements that can have multiple meanings or support multiple storylines. Plant seeds that could grow into two types of plants. Think in terms of what this could mean later. However, when those events first occur, readers shouldn't notice that they might have another deeper meaning. And then discard obvious solutions, brainstorm ways readers will guess that the scene will end, and then discard those ideas, and then try to brainstorm something else. Another absolutely key thing is character, and character is revealed through action. That is by far the most important thing to know about developing your characters and revealing them to the reader. It's through their actions. Actions include choices. Choices especially made under pressure. Choices under pressure reveal a lot about who your character is. Stephen James has a wonderful metaphor for thinking about your characters. Is your character a kayaker or an inner tube floater? So inner tube floaters are passive. Passive characters are not interesting. They just float aimlessly through your story. Readers want to see a kayaker fight the current as they maneuver their way downstream. In a lot of thriller stories, your main character may start out being just completely buffeted by events, sort of like an inner tuber, but a key part of the story is at some point, they kind of look in the mirror and they say, I've got to do something, I've got to take a risk, I've got to take charge, or I've got to, put myself into this thing, and then they become a kayaker. Don't focus on what your character likes or dislikes. Focus on what choices they would make and reveal them through those choices. Characters should be appealing. Your protagonist especially needs to be appealing in some way. They don't have to be nice, and they don't have to be likable, but they have to have, I think charisma is the best word for it. If they're fully unlikable, people aren't going to like the book. They're not going to want to spend all that time with a character that doesn't have something that appeals to them or makes them charismatic, if not likable. So be sure to do that if you have a character who's maybe not obviously likable. But ways of, how do you do that? How do you make a character likable or give them something that would make them appealing to the reader? Little tricks are showing your character being good at something. If they have a special skill or they're just something that they're good at, people like that. Characters with a sense of humor are likable. Show your character treating other people well. You always like kindness or some way showing them treating other people well. Show yourself character as an underdog or having suffered some undeserved misfortune. Creates sympathy and brings the reader to them. Show another character cares for them or likes them. Show us that. And then, the reader subconsciously, we all, well, if that person, even if it's their dog, a lot of times I've actually seen a number of books where people try to soften the villain by putting a dog in there. Well, his dog loves him at least, right? And he's good to his dog. I mean, it's an opportunity to show more of the character than just the bad, whatever plot to destroy the world they're going for. First impressions matter a lot with characters, as they do in real life. Choose carefully what you show your protagonist doing when they're introduced. Make it meaningful, and use it as an example of showing, not telling, who the character is. Don't introduce your character with a big laundry list of description of, where they went to college and how much money they earn and whether they like chocolate or not. Show us in a scene, an active scene of them doing something, of them volunteering at a food bank, or of them at their job at the nursing home, or of them engaging in a stock trade. Something that shows, some of the backstory and also shows something about their character by the choices that they're making. Show, don't tell. Probably most of you have heard this command before. In your stories, avoid saying anything in this format. He was blank. That's showing. He was tired, he was scared, he was eager. Don't do that. Show us the scared, show us the tired, and then you don't have to say it that way. Stephen James says, to show is to render, to tell is to summarize. So you want to render what's happening, what's being felt, what's going on. Show emotional state or response by how the character reacts. Show aptitude or personality type by action or dialogue. Don't just say he was judgmental. Show a scene in which the character is being judgmental. Don't say they're patient. Show them getting cut off in traffic and responding with some sappy, like calm thing as a response. Show special skills. Don't say she was a good hunter. Have a scene in the hunt. It's just way more interesting to read when you do it that way. I think J.K. Rowling was very good at this in little small ways throughout the Harry Potter books. Here's 2 examples that I pulled from those books that I think show character rather than telling. Mrs. Weasley tried to force him to eat 4 helpings at every meal. That's a wonderful showing of who Mrs. Weasley is. It doesn't say she's a mother. It doesn't say she was very involved in giving. It doesn't say she was a cook. I mean, it just shows all that stuff in one little thing about who she is. Harry was dragging his feet along the 2nd floor corridor to Lockhart's office. He gritted his teeth and knocked. The door flew open at once. Lockhart beamed down at him. So she does not say, if I asked you, how did Harry feel about going to Lockhart's office? You know how he felt, but she never said it. She showed it. And how did Lockhart feel? Well, she shows that too, without saying it. So, well done, J.K. And all of this applies to your villain as well. Your antagonist is the hero of his own story. Show us and give us justification. Pacing. Avoid info dumps. This is another very common problem in manuscripts that still need editing. As a writer, you may have all this information about your character, about your setting, and you feel like you need to tell. You either want to tell because you're excited about it, or you feel like you need to know it because you know it, so the reader should know it. And maybe you're right. Maybe it does need to be told. Probably some of it does not. I think definitely the bias among writers is that we want to tell more than we need to. There's a lot that we end up telling that really never had to be told. It's good to have in your mind. It helps you be consistent and thorough in your character development, but you don't have to tell the reader explicitly. But if there is stuff you have to tell, don't tell it all at once. Try to break it up, incorporate it into little bits here and there throughout the narrative, and only when really necessary. Big chunks of exposition bog down the narrative, and especially nowadays with our short attention spans, and especially in thriller fiction, people will immediately notice that long paragraph and they will just skip it. So keep it out by and large, break it up whenever possible. Readers skip over the good parts because they can see on the page. One rule of thumb is try on every page or in every chapter and across the book at all levels, try to have equal parts of dialogue, narrative, and action. It's a nice balance to shoot for. Dialogue, narrative, and action in equal parts. Now, dialogue is a form of action. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about dialogue is action, and it is in terms of plot and tension. But you get the point here. Like on the actual page, the white and the black on the page, dialogue, narrative, and action in equal parts. Trust your reader to fill in the blanks on what they don't know or what you haven't told them. Now, a random tip that I add on this slide, never introduce a team all at once. I've seen this in manuscripts too. A team or anytime where you have, say, more than 2 characters, really, try not to have them all being introduced together in one scene. I have a terrible time with names in real life and in books. I get very confused with names, so use different first letters for the names of all your main characters. It's just really helpful to the readers, and don't introduce them all at once. Give them each, first impressions matter. Give each important character a scene showing them doing something, introducing the character in that way helps the reader remember them, keep them straight later. Ideally, in any book, fiction, any fiction genre, and to some extent in nonfiction too, there should be some kind of tension in every scene. It doesn't have to be big tension. It can be very small tension, but tension is hugely important. Tension is what happens when you have two opposing forces. Stephen James says, tension is born when conflict meets desire. So it gets back to our story, right? What makes a story? Conflict plus motivation plus a goal. Tension requires that there be something at stake. What are the stakes? Stakes are who gets hurt, in what way, and how deeply if the protagonist fails to accomplish their goal. So the whole book is going to have stakes. Individual scenes should have something at stake. Stakes must be high enough for the reader to care, but also believable and proportionate to the story. So in a thriller, stakes are usually pretty high. Death, global mayhem, intergalactic destruction, big stakes. That's just the genre. It's not necessary for stakes in general. Stakes can be very intimate. Will I be able to attend my friend's wedding? There may be things standing in the way of this important goal. So think in terms of or else. Stakes are all about, this, or else. And we have to accomplish this or else. Dilemmas also create tension. Take two things your character believes in strongly and make him choose between the two. Compromising what he values or losing something precious in the process. So dilemmas reveal character. Choices reveal character. Dilemmas are a great way to really drill down on choices and also create a ton of tension. Remember that action actually ruins suspense or tension. Once the suspense is before the bullets start flying or the cars start chasing. After that, you've got action, but usually that's a drop in tension when it starts. So use action to reveal something greater about the character or story. Action itself is not as good as tension for keeping the reader engaged. Escalation, another way to build tension. In thrillers, just when you think things couldn't get any worse, they do. The stakes should escalate over and over again in a thriller. In my book Petroplague, it begins with the main character being worried about losing the progress she's made toward earning her academic degree. So something's at stake for her. By the end of the book, the survival of Los Angeles is at stake, and by the end, she's worried about the end of civilization as we know it. So you've got escalating stakes in a typical thriller. Escalation applies not only to plot, but also to emotion. Don't start at the highest level emotionally for your characters. If you have your character show anger or frustration early, be sure to allow room for that to get bigger and allow ways for you to show it. So early in the book, you might have anger expressed as a sigh. And later it might be a yell, and at the end it might be actual physical violence. Allow room for escalation of stakes and of plot. I don't know, do we have any Stranger Things fans? Never mind. Here's a little trick that I learned at Craft Fest that I've kept with me ever since, because I really haven't heard it other places. Use psychic distance to manipulate tension. Psychic distance is how tightly the reader feels attached to the point of view character in a scene. Sometimes you feel like you're kind of far out, and sometimes you really feel like you're in the scene with the character, and it's the author creates that feeling. A simple way to the smaller the psychic distance, the tighter the reader feels embedded in the character, the more tension you can create. If the reader feels kind of far away, there's not as much tension. If they don't really care, it's all it comes down really to how much do you care. So this is a very simple trick for manipulating psychic distance. How do you refer to the character in the scene? The furthest psychic distance, the most abstract, is to refer to the character by something like a title or a role, like the doctor or the bus driver in the scene. A little bit closer is to use the character's name. George in the scene is a little bit closer. The tightest is to use just the pronoun he. And so a good way to do this is to start the scene with the name to anchor the point of view in that character, but then as soon as possible shift to the pronouns and use the names as sparingly as possible. Because when you stick the name in a bunch of times, it just I don't know why, it's just a psychic thing. It creates a little bit of psychic distance. So use pronouns when you can. Of course, there's challenges to that when there's more than one character in a scene, especially if they're the same gender, but something to aspire to. Read another quick excerpt here on suspense. Your protagonist is about to open her bedroom closet door. Does the scene have suspense? If readers know that a killer is hiding in the closet and the protagonist does not know, there is suspense. Does it have mystery? If readers think that the closet might contain a clue, but that no danger awaits, yes, there's mystery. Does it have horror? If readers know that she's about to discover a decapitated body when she opens the door, there is horror. The same event can evoke concern, curiosity, or dread based on what readers know and expect and what they don't. In writing circles, there seems to be a common misconception that we create suspense by withholding information. In truth, it's the opposite. We create suspense by revealing information. We create mystery by withholding it. So that's interesting to think about. You create suspense in your reader a lot of times by telling them something, giving them some inkling of what is coming or what may be coming. You hint at things. A word on dialogue. In contemporary thriller, this is definitely a style of the times thing. People have done it differently in the past. It was more the standard. But the standard now in contemporary thriller fiction is to minimize the use of dialogue tags. By dialogue tag, we mean instead of saying, having a quotation and saying she stammered or she gushed or he said peevishly or ruefully. Those are like complicated dialogue tags. You don't use dialogue tags. Just say he said, she said, or nothing at all. But using that dialogue tag to modify or explain is frowned upon now. Avoid ing and as. So this is really just a contemporary style issue. This is considered bad, this is considered good. That's terrific, she said as she clapped her hands. That's terrific, she said, clapping her hands. The preferred is she clapped her hands. That's terrific. So there you go. If you're submitting to agents or publishers, that's a good one to know. Another little thing I heard somebody use once, minimize bogsat, which they defined as a bunch of guys sitting around talking. So dialogue is super powerful in terms of revealing character, and it can create a lot of tension in dialogue, but it also can be really bland. And an example of that would be if you just have people sitting around talking because maybe there's some information you needed to reveal. You couldn't think of any way to do it except to have some boring conversation with people who are not doing anything. So that's boring. Don't have a bunch of guys sitting around talking. But having a bunch of guys sitting around talking actually can be super exciting if there's enough going on in the dialogue. There's a movie and theater production called August Osage County, which has a dinner scene that is like the most conflict-laden scene I have ever seen, where it's just people sitting still and moving their lips, right? It's just unbelievable. Family, yeah. Sorry?
And tearing each other up.
Yeah, Yeah, just so much conflict, and it's great. That's just talk. It's dialogue. It's very powerful dialogue. One thing you can do to make dialogue strong and full of tension is to use subtext. Subtext is the true meaning that is left unspoken. All the stuff that's not said. It's psychologically sophisticated and it can create tension. You can have a trivial conversation that is laden with subtext. So, for example, my mom might come to my house, go into my teenage son's bedroom, and say something like, "I see you've been buying potato chips." Which seems like a bland enough comment, but she laughs because she knows there is so much subtext going on there on so many levels. And if you can do that and have your reader clued into that, you can make your dialogue very powerful. Every thriller and every genre novel, really, in some fashion, has a climax. Specifically in thrillers, there should appear to be no way out. That's the best, when there's no way out. But then, of course, the challenge of the author is to find a way out that's believable and not, something that fell out of the sky. Something you want to do in your climax for any kind of book is, ideally, your character's choices should determine the ending. That makes for the strongest story. Something that your character chooses or does, says, some action they take, is really what determines the end of the adventure. Don't rely on someone else coming to the rescue or on coincidences for things to work out. The ending is a good place for a dilemma, a hard choice that costs the protagonist something or puts something at risk. Always good stuff for a climax. There should be escalation, ideally within a climax, especially in a thriller. You've had escalation across the book, and then if you can escalate again in the stakes at the end, that's good. Here's a good tip. Style change in the climax for a thriller, and maybe others. You're escalating the tension, you're accelerating the pace. How do you accelerate pace towards the end of a novel? Well, one little trick is to shorten your sentences and paragraphs. So a style change. You may have been writing paragraphs of an average size or sentences of an average length throughout. Shorten it. Whatever it is, make it shorter. And it's going to feel like acceleration to the reader. Avoid description. This is not the time to notice the smell of the coffee, unless it's directly relevant to the action that's happening. So no more description. Focus real tightly on what the character is experiencing. Really, really shorten that psychic distance. Get very much inside their head. Now, sometimes in an action sequence, in a way, you're slowing down, right? You can have a fight scene that in quote, real life would only take a few seconds, but may take several paragraphs to write out. So in that sense, it's slowing down. But overall, there's a sense of acceleration, that everything is happening fast. And you can use the shorter sentences, paragraphs to do that. Make sure your climax is long enough. It should be the most emotionally fulfilling part of the book. If it's too abrupt, the reader will feel cheated. And so we come to the climax. That was it. Wasn't that exciting? The climax of my talk. And we're at the end. So these are titles of some good books for writing thriller, the craft of thriller writing. The first one by Stephen James is my favorite, and I read some excerpts from that for you. And that is my deal. Do we have anything else you guys want to talk about?
Questions?
Yes.
What are the ways that best to use the notion of chapter?
Interesting. Do you have a hidden agenda with that question? Something specific, or are you just waiting to see what I say about it? I'm curious.
Well, one of the dilemmas is, do you create 20 stories, 20 beginnings and endings, or are they pauses or scene changes? I want to manipulate the reader the goal is essentially to manipulate the reader. And so I'm trying to think, you create all this tension, you have some relief, and you begin a new set of tensions.
You know, this is really something I struggle with because my motive, my incentive as a writer and a reader are completely different. When I read, so I'll tell you that, and the most successful commercial thriller fiction nowadays uses chapters quite differently than they would have been used 50 years ago. I think, you know, I grew up reading chapter is an ending, right? It's the ending of a scene break, something is resolved. Maybe then there's a little teaser of what's to come next, but by and large, it's like it feels like a contained unit. It's a place to stop and put the book down and go to sleep. Well, that's not what they're doing now. Instead, it's almost like when I look at some of these books, it almost looks like they structured a book like that, but then they frame shifted the breaks, right? And so now in modern thriller fiction, most chapters end with a cliffhanger, essentially. You know, essentially some, you know, maybe a low stakes, maybe high stakes, but something that really feels unfinished, so that you don't put the book down at the end of the chapter, you just keep going. So, you know, right, wrong, that, you know, it does help people get through the book, keep them awake at night. Yes.
The Martian was a good example of that. At the end of a chapter, he was in a bit worse fix than he was at the beginning of the chapter, through the whole book.
Yep.
I remember that.
And you know, if it's done well, I seem to remember in that book it was okay, and it did make you want to keep going. But sometimes it irritates me when I read it, and that's not an effect you want to have on the reader either.
Why did it irritate you?
Because I needed a place to stop. I felt like I needed. It was. I didn't want to keep reading, and I guess, and I think part of it is because I kind of read things a little bit analytically now, and I could see what they were doing, and I'm like, that's just so manipulative.
That's the term.
I got lots of hands up. Anything on that topic, or
Yes,
yeah, okay, yeah.
One of the things that irritate me is to get to the end of the chapter and then the author puts himself in the book, like so-and-so was leaving the state, and then the last line is, and that was the last time he saw his father alive. And that just drives me crazy. It's like a teaser, but who is this person that's saying that? I just don't need that. I find that really irritating.
And that kind of example typically is violating point of view as well.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and that's you're feeling that.
Author
You're
jumping
feeling
in.
that. Yes.
Okay, I have a question about POV,
Yes.
which I struggle with all the time because I'm everybody in the book. You know, I want to know what everybody's doing and thinking at the same time, and so I really struggle to focus on one person. How would you deal with if the gripping part of the story has to do with the fact that your protagonist does not know what has happened and does not find out what has happened for a long time? So it can't be her point of view. Can I all of a sudden, even though I've introduced some characters, and can I put them in there and it can be their point of view, but when the scene is over, I'm done with them? I mean, can you do that, or does the reader go, well, what's this? Is that confusing?
Well, I mean, if it's really well done, you could get away with it, but there's definitely a risk that the reader's going to see that it was a throwaway character for the sole purpose of, conveying some information. So you're saying you have a situation where the reader needs to know something about what's happening that the protagonist does not know.
Correct.
That's the challenge, and so how do you do that? Yeah, well, you're definitely going to need to either have multiple point of view characters, or you could do the book in an omniscient voice. That's totally allowed.
And do I have to start at the beginning with that, or can I move it in and move it out of it?
I think if, so, like doing multiple things. So I think I would recommend in general, if you're going to go with an omniscient voice or point of view, you should either do it only in the opening chapter or do it throughout. That just feels to me like like using it periodically would, I don't Yeah, so one thing that you do see in contemporary thriller fiction is you'll see the protagonist is an I, first person point of view, and the villain or antagonist is third person. And so, and all the other characters, if there are additional ones. But a lot of times you'll have just those two point of view characters through the whole book. It's either the, you know, like the detective or the killer. And one is in one point of view and the other's in the other. So that's popular. Otherwise, it tends to be all third person with, you know, a couple of characters who are carefully chosen. I think the best solution to your, I mean, this is part of the, you know, the construction of the book challenge. You know, how are you going to deal with this? I welcome some comments from everybody else in a second, but the idea of intentionally introducing a character for the sole purpose of conveying whatever that information is seems risky. And if there's another way to do it, that would be the way to do it. Or to have use one of the characters that has more than one purpose in the story, another subplot or something. You might want to get with a group and brainstorm specifically what it is, you know, that specific book. What is it that you need to convey? And you know, somebody might have some ideas about how you could have it revealed. I know in my science thrillers, I sometimes need to convey some technical information, and so you can do that as, you know, a character has a dialogue with someone else, or that they're reading something, they're reading a newspaper article, and you know, kind of enliven it in that way and provide the information that way. Does anybody have any thoughts for her on what she's doing?
The kind of Robert Penn Warren model, in other words, having the narrator be not the main character, but the next to main character. So,
Like Dr. Watson.
like Dr. Watson, or like Huey Long's staff person who describes the whole Huey Long experience, but he also grows and changes himself.
Yeah, that could work if you wanted to shift completely to an associated person's POV. That potentially could work real well.
Okay, thank you.
So on the POV, so you say that it is okay to change the POV 3 to 5 times throughout the book?
You can change it as often as you want, but never in the same scene without a clear scene break.
But you can change it.
You can definitely change, and you don't want to have too many point of view characters in the book. So I think I said 3 to 5 would be considered a max. Yeah. So, because each of those is being given a certain importance. I mean, typically in a thriller you'll have, well, it depends. There are some thrillers that have like teams, and so each of those characters gets a point of view. But the main thing is that once you're in a scene, you're in somebody's point of view, and you stay there completely, unless you clearly signal with a scene break or something that indicates we're now shifting to another character's point of view.
I had a thought about this, the other character, Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, something like that, where she's seeing the whole thing and yet learning herself.
Yeah, she looks a little bit like an omniscient narrator. Well, she is a narrator, but she's not an omniscient narrator.
No.
It's very much a first-person story. We're seeing everything interpreted through her eyes. So a very tight point of view in that story.
Writing is a craft, and so it's an art form, just like M.C. Escher, you know, a person and a person in a box and a box. And so, you know, it's an art form, but manipulating the reader seems off-putting to someone who isn't a writer. And just like you said, that you read differently than you write, because you don't want to feel you're manipulated. You want to feel it's authentic. So I'm wondering if there's a different term we can use. I know that.
Instead of manipulating the reader?
Yeah, because it just sounds so mercenary.
Yes. Well, in thrillers, you could simply say you want to encourage them to turn the page. You know? Encourage them, that's the goal, is turn the page. Don't put it down. Which is, you know, the goal of the whole book, of course. These are just tactics for getting that accomplished. Yes.
I've heard an old adage one time that the strength of the story rides on how strong the villain is. The idea being that if the hero or heroine has to go up against stronger odds, that makes you care about the hero more, and obviously want to find out what happens if it's a stronger villain. Have you encountered anything like that in
I
the
have-
research?
I have not heard that particular formulation. What it makes me think is it's not so much about the villain as it is about the stakes. And the villain, because the villain doesn't need to be strong, the villain would need to be proportionate to the challenge.
Oh, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, if the, and it also relates to the idea of story as goals plus conflict plus motivation. I mean, the conflict comes from, you know, between the villain and the protagonist and the antagonist, whatever that might be. There has to be an appropriate conflict. If there's no conflict, if it's too easy, then nobody cares. But if it's truly impossible, then, you know, then that's just
Oh, yeah.
frustrating. So I guess, yeah, in terms of like, do you need a strong villain? You need a villain, an antagonist, or, you know, a force creating conflict for the protagonist that creates real conflict. So it does need to be strong enough. But then I would say that what really matters is the stakes. I mean, there can be a ton of conflict, but if there's nothing at stake, who cares, right? I mean, there has to be something that matters to the protagonist, and it can be something simple and personal and intimate, but it has to be important to that character.
I have a question on conflict. Normally we consider conflict to be another person, some other thing. How about when the conflict is the character's moral discernment? So he's acting in one way, but in his moral makeup, he understands it's wrong, so he's got this conflict. Is that used very effectively?
Absolutely, right?
Okay.
And somebody in this room can help me out here. What are the archetypes or whatever? It's like man versus nature, man versus man versus self.
Yeah.
Internal conflict. Yeah, and this is just an example of one of those. There are all these different forms of conflict that create story. In a thriller novel, that would not be the primary conflict, although it could be a very interesting way to reveal character. Again, dilemmas, the choices characters make, tell us about them. But a thriller novel usually has some sort of external, real, usually often a physical threat. But yeah, obviously, tons of great fiction has been written, you know, from the perspective of, you know, people wrestling with internal conflict, and moral conflict would certainly be a part of that.
Any more questions? If not, we thank you.
Your books are for sale?
I do.
How much are they?
The paperbacks are 10, the hardcovers are 15.